Absolutely. There we go.
What a deal.
What a deal. Well, I don't think we've ever met.
Nope.
So why don't you tell me a little bit about yourself?
Well, I guess I'll start with kind of where I found how I got here and how I found this kind of corner of the internet. I'd say maybe 2017, 2018 or so. I was listening to Joe Rogan, and I had really been interested in the kinds of conversations that Joe was having, the long form discussions, and his willingness to go deep into topics and talk to people that, you know, the mainstream media or other people just wouldn't talk to at all. And then through that, I think, is where I found Jordan Peterson, and he was the same way. And then kind of at the end of 2018, I started a job where I was driving multiple hours and started listening to lots of Jordan Peterson lectures and dug into his Genesis lectures and really found that fascinating. And the Genesis lectures really spoke to me because it was approaching biblical knowledge in a way that I had never heard it approached before. So that kind of leads into how I grew up, which is in a more fundamentalist Christian household. My family was definitely religious. We went to church every week. We were Sabbath. We keep the Sabbath, and so, you know, have some different beliefs than maybe mainstream Christianity or something. I'm not explicitly Protestant or Catholic or Orthodox or anything like that. I would say non-denominational Christian, but like I said, fundamentalist. So I grew up with a very literal understanding of the Bible, and I would say, in looking back, I've always had a very intellectual and academic relationship with God, which, now that I've heard John Vervaeke, it's a very propositional way of knowing God. And so that's it's been very interesting to explore Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke and Jonathan Pageau and your work. And so it's been pretty interesting in that respect. So that's kind of how I got here and kind of my background. So
do you still go to church?
Well, that's kind of an interesting question, because with the whole COVID thing, it kind of became a convenient reason to not really go to church anymore. And I had been struggling. One of the things I'd like to talk about a little bit is deconstruction. And I had been kind of going through a period of over a number of years of deconstruction, I think. And for a couple of years prior to COVID, I had pretty much acknowledged to myself that I was only going to church because I didn't have a good reason not to, and I didn't want to just jettison it willy-nilly. And I was also pretty involved with the technical side of things at church, so I had a skill set in video production and audio and that kind of thing. And like, well, maybe I can just go to church and use my skills to help out the congregation, and maybe while I'm there, I'll hear something that will help. And so I think that's one of my, in the process of deconstruction and understanding, you know, more about participatory knowing, I'm starting to see the value in church and in the rituals and some of those things. And yet I'm still struggling with the propositional aspects of it, because it does seem like Jordan Peterson and John Vervaeke notwithstanding, there are in fact propositional aspects to religion that kind of really matter. And I don't know, I don't know how to deal with those kind of things. So I'm still trying to sort that out. I guess I'm wrestling with those kind of things. So,
What kind of church have you been going to?
It's the same church that I grew up in, so
Okay.
it's a non-denominational Sabbath keeping
Okay.
church. So
Okay. Okay. Um,
I thought I had put down some notes here about kind of the process that I went through of deconstruction, and maybe some of my steps back into reconstruction that maybe would be
yeah,
useful to walk through.
I'd like to hear them.
All right. So I think that my deconstruction phase kind of started with questioning the role of the Holy Spirit. And so that's given on baptism. And the question is something like, what is the role of the Holy Spirit? So, I have to submit to God. I have to choose to submit to God. But the scripture talks about that the carnal mind is enmity against God. And so in my natural state, I wouldn't want to necessarily choose God's way. But then God is, am I choosing God, or does the Holy Spirit now choose God for me somehow? And so what's my role in this, and what's the role of the Holy Spirit in this? And then I was also obviously influenced by science. I'm a civil engineer by schooling, so I have a more analytical way of looking at things, and I'm fairly high in openness, and so I tend to question things a lot, and sometimes that's not necessarily good for me, but this science seems like look, I can see these things, that you can observe this thing, so it didn't always seem to jive with the propositions that I was being taught in church. And so I got interested in apologetics for a while to address the question, does scientific evidence actually point to God's existence, or are we just wishing this to be true? And the conclusion that I came to, so I read The Case for a Creator, and I don't remember who that's by at the moment.
It was, if it's a case book, was it Lee Strobel?
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's how he was a lawyer, so he
yes,
always writes his book, The Case.
Yep. So I read that and looked through a lot of other things, and kind of the conclusion I came to was that while there might be issues with any individual scientific or philosophical argument for God's existence, if you take them all together, that seems to present a pretty reasonable case for at least an intelligent being that created the universe. And I guess I determined at some point that I'm willing to take a leap of faith, because I don't think you're ever going to prove exactly for certain that God exists or doesn't exist, but I'm not taking a blind leap of faith. And there seems like there would be some reasonable amount of evidence that would point to it. So that's kind of where I got to on that. But eventually I got kind of concerned that I was trying to be right, or trying to prove other people wrong. And having gone to church for so many years, and every week, and definitely very involved and academically pretty, I'm more of academically focused on it. It's like, oh, I know all these doctrines, and I can prove this and I can prove that, and I can prove you wrong, and I can support your points. And at some point it's like, well, it seems like I care more about the rhetoric rather than the content. And I thought it was interesting that Jordan Peterson talked about that in his recent Cambridge lecture. So that was kind of interesting to hear. But at some point I realized that I didn't seem to care about the message. And it came to me at the point where I was involved with the technical aspects on a pretty big setup for an annual event that we do. And it just occurred to me at some point that, if it wasn't for the content, if it wasn't for the message, I wouldn't have a job to do here. And so if I don't care about the message, then what's the point? And along with that, I realized that I've never really experienced or understood the personal relationship with God. And I realized that I don't think I've ever had an experience in my life where I thought, wow, that was obviously God's hand in my life. And I've never had a religious experience per se. Not that those are the be all end all, but not even like I never felt like I had a personal relationship with God other than an academic understanding that the Bible tells me that God is looking for a personal relationship with me. And it's like, well, I look around, like I don't see that. So
I had a friend in college who she was sort of bucking evangelicalism, and she said, there's nowhere in the Bible that it says I need to have a daily quiet time. And she was also somewhere in the back of my mind, the language of personal relationship is something that comes. Now, clearly you can find it attested throughout the history of the church, but it's something that really comes into our culture in a strong way in the 70s, and that timing isn't incidental. And I think that in many ways actually gets at a reaction to the overemphasis on the propositional P at the expense of the participatory and the procedural and the perspectival. So, well, let me ask you this. Do you want a personal relationship with God?
Well, that's a good question. And that's kind of one of the things I started thinking about in terms of reconstruction phase. It's like, at some point, what more do I need to know propositionally to accept God? And if I could have the answers to my most burning questions, would I then be willing to submit to God? And so, like, those are really difficult questions to answer. And I guess I think I want a relationship with God. And it's like, I would like to believe that God is there and that he's personally involved in my life. But at the same time, it feels a little strange. I guess I get influenced by the materialistic side of things, that like, well, that means that somebody else is involved in my life. I'm giving away my agency in terms of, well, maybe now it makes me sort of helpless and, something like that. So I don't know.
Do you have a wife or a girlfriend or a relationship like that?
No.
Okay. One of the differences, and again, a lot of Vervaeke's work gets at this. I mean, let's say there was a woman or someone that you were interested in. You could know a lot of things about her. You could know how she looks. You could know her birthday. You could know where she grew up. You could know her school or education. You could see her transcripts. I mean, you could know all of these things, but persons are such that in many ways that the knowledge of a person always has propositional. You can distill propositions from, you can look at me and say, oh, Paul Vanderklay has a big beard right now. He's bald. He usually wears this black fleece during the winter. You can say a lot. He's got bookshelves, right? You could distill a whole lot of propositions, but to know a person is fundamentally, and to be in relationship with a person is really running on a different track.
Right.
I often use Pascal's spirit of geometry or spirit of finesse, because with a person, it's always, engaging. It's back and forth. It's I do this and they do this and I do this and they do this. And all along the way, you can sort of harvest propositions out of it if you want to. And propositions are really nice because they're fairly stable. They're sort of upper register things. They don't change in time so much, although, my beard might change, but that I had a beard and you're talking to a guy with a beard now. All that propositional stuff is really useful because it's sort of static and sort of fixed in the air. But the The living stuff is the stuff that tends to hold us and keep us longer. And I think it's for that reason that the propositional isn't an enemy or problematic necessarily, but the propositional at the expense of the others is, you won't really, let's say if you were fascinated by a particular pop star or an actress or something, you could know all these kinds of things about her, but to be in a personal relationship is an entirely different thing. There's a vulnerability to that. It's much more of an adventure. It's much more of a living thing. And
Right.
so, but it's also the case that, let's say there was a particular celebrity or someone out there that you felt yourself desiring a relationship with this person. That's always, you can't, I mean, for sort of the way agents are, you can't force them into that.
Right.
You can invite, you can ask, you can set a table, you can even sort of try to capture them in some ways. But, and that, I don't mean that physically or in a kidnapping sort of way,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
if I would, when I was single and in college, I would encounter some women that I might be interested in. And so then it's like, okay, propositionally, I was fairly logical and rational. Okay, I tend to bump into them here. I'll make sure that I'm always here at this point so I can make eye contact and I can smile. And then, just, they're like little bids. And then, okay, now we have had a little conversation, can take the conversation deeper. And then I might have a little bit more of a conversation and getting to know them a little bit more. Then it's like, yeah, okay, well, I've lost interest, and then I move on. And so it's very much a living thing. And I think the passion and the fun and the endurance and the living nature of if a religion is only sort of static, it's just sort of sitting on the shelf like a bunch of other static things.
Yes, exactly. And that's kind of where I got to with the apologetics thing. And it's like, well, I can make all these arguments, I can prove all these points, and then I can put the book back on the shelf and continue on with my life. And it didn't really do anything. It doesn't change my life. And so, what you're describing there is like the propositional aspect, is that the relationship with God is the important part. And then the participatory part is actually having the relationship. But I guess where that breaks down for me is in the relationship part. It just seems very one-sided to me. And
how so?
I say that, how so?
How so? Yeah.
Oh, it's like if I have a relationship with a woman, then I can see her, I can speak to her, and then she can respond directly, and there's a tangible, real person there.
Right.
And so the tangible, real part of it, and I pray, I read the Bible, I meditate, I'm doing all these things, but there doesn't necessarily seem like there's any relationship part coming back to me.
Yeah.
In the sense that I think of a relationship.
Yeah.
And so when you talk about God number one and God number two, the relationship aspect and the way I think most Christians understand God is the agentic God. Is that God number two? Is that correct?
Yep.
So, and so I have trouble. I think I've always had trouble believing in that real, the really real, tangible being that I can't see, that is a spirit. But then number one a lot more, and the spirit of a group, or the spirit of a conversation, or the non-theist way of looking at God, or the archetypal view of God, or the mythological, or something like that. And I can see those aspects a lot more, and I can understand that, and that makes sense to me. But it doesn't strike me as the way that religion looks at God. And
right,
if I'm going to commit myself to a church, in any way. You know, if I'm going to get baptized into a church, I have to accept propositions about the agentic God. And so that's kind of where I'm struggling to put these pieces together.
Have you asked God for a personal relationship?
Well, I think I finally came to that earlier this summer. It's like, well, maybe I should ask God, like, if you're there and if you desire to have a personal relationship with me, please reveal yourself in a way that's specific and personal to me,
Yeah.
that I could actually understand, and that, you know, I wouldn't pass off as something else. And I guess the best thing that the the closest thing that I've come to since then, is that the connections that I make between disparate, you know, I think about lots of different things, and when these things start clicking together, maybe that's the personal relationship with God, or the way, you know, there's a passage that talks about how there are different gifts, but they're all of one body, and to some are given a word of encouragement, some are given teaching, and some are given knowledge. And so I shouldn't, you know, if I have a very academic relationship with God, and if that's the way that I relate to God, I shouldn't feel like I'm somehow lesser of a Christian, and I also shouldn't feel like I'm more important because I can understand things technically. I shouldn't feel more important than other Christians who know God in a different way. And so it's been, I guess maybe that's, you know, it's like, I suppose in struggling to put all these pieces together, I don't suppose I'll ever be able to put them all together all the way in my life. And so maybe it's sufficient to say that I'm willing to wrestle with God for the rest of my life, even if I never get to certainty, but get baptized so that I can commit myself to a community.
Yeah.
Um,
I wouldn't start a relationship with "if you're there." I mean, people do it all the time, and it's an honest expression. But if another person kind of engaged you with the same type of bid or introduction, what do you mean if I'm here? Or it's it I think part of the asking and inviting is taking tentative steps towards that require risk. You know, for example, also if let's say if thinking back to my single days, if I saw a girl that I was interested in and felt some attraction to, there's risk in terms of approaching her. She may shut me down. I may learn that she already has a boyfriend. I may discover that I'm not at all what she's looking for. She's not in a whatever. I mean, there's always this chance of being turned away, and there's also in this a bit of fear that God isn't like that job listing where you fill in an application. God is a free, so not unlike the potential lover. God is a free agent, and he can decide to come near you or stay away. I also think in terms of the tangible aspect, I was listening to the conversation that Jordan Peterson just posted with the guy talking about the psychology of narrative. That was a really deep, fascinating, a little bit chaotic conversation, but in it, Peterson says something that he says all the time, which I've continued to try to get my mind around, in that, we don't really see objects, we see patterns. And, the more I think about that, the more it's true. And that also helps with seeing the God who is both agentic and arenic, because people's personal relationship with God, it's easy to get cynical about that, because it's fundamentally different than a personal relationship with my mother or my wife or my child or someone in my church. Yet, my personal relationship with my wife or my mother or one of my children or a person in my church or someone here on the street, that's also a relationship with a pattern. And it's just that we're very common, or we're very adept at having relationships with non-corporeal patterns. We do it all the time. We have relationships. Let's say if you work for a corporation, you have a relationship with your employer. Now, there might be a boss and there might be a president or a CEO, but you have a relationship with your employer, and your employer is not physical like I am. Your employer is, I don't like the term hyper object, but your employer is this very strange pattern, this very strange entity that is very real and very significant in terms of how your life unfolds, and you're very invested in that relationship. But that's not a relationship with someone like a wife or a daughter or something like that. So I think a helpful analogy is, yeah, if let's say if you want a relationship with God, pursue one. And in fact, Jesus puts that right out in the Sermon on the Mount: ask and you will find, knock and the door will be open. Now, it doesn't mean that it's going to be instant. We're sort of conditioned by our context right now to expect instantaneous response that will meet our satisfaction. Well, that's not going to be that way. And if you think about it, it stands to reason why not. So I don't know if any of that helps.
Yeah. So what you said about the corporation that makes sense to me, but that seems like God number one.
Yes.
That's very arenic, and it's rather impersonal. And again, that's like, to me, I don't think that's what most Christians believe in, but
right.
That the corporation analogy seems more like what I could believe in. Based on what I can understand, it seems more the case than a being per se. But again, there's Christ, the insistence in the Gospels or in the New Testament is that Christ became a physical person, and that it's he's not an arena. He is a person, and he is a being. Now he's a spirit being, but
he's still physical and spiritual. That's what the resurrection says.
Right. So yeah,
but he's also arenic, because if you look at the epistles, we are called to be in Christ. And so Paul talks about Christ in an arenic way often. That's why I say people are always trying to map God number one and God number two on the Trinity. And I always resist that, because each person of the Trinity is both agentic and arenic. But you're right. And if you pursue a personal relationship, you want something more with God than you have with something like your employer. You want something that's also analogous to a relationship with a spouse. I think about my wife. My wife is very much obviously agentic, but there's also an arenic quality to my wife. When my children come home, my wife inhabits the house that she decorated, that
there's a spirit of the family there.
Exactly.
Yeah. Well, and that's the talk, or the things I've been listening to in the last couple of months on all these channels about spirit. It's like, I never really looked at it that way, in terms of, as a church congregation, we're together in the same spirit, because it's like having the spirit of the conversation. It's not really necessarily how I ever looked at it before. And all these different words, you made a video a while back about the spirit that went along with, was it the 9/11, the spirit of sorry, I'm blanking on what the term that you used was, but team spirit and school spirit and spirit week and all these things. Just it's fascinating to start to see the symbology of all these things.
Yeah.
And so anyway,
but I know that, I mean, it's not uncommon, obviously. You're in you around you as a church, and many of those people at different levels. As a pastor, it's really hard to sort of judge people by their appearances, because you peel back the layers and people have various levels of joy, disappointment, doubt. I mean, that's all there, even though when people show up in a room like that, they're conforming and participating and performing. That's all pretty normal, but it's by no means uncommon that, people experience this personal relationship. Now, I would also say that the variabilities of human personality are not, and temperament are not disconnected to this either. Some people are experiencing personal relationships all the time with everything. And if you're an engineer, part of you is, I have a son who's an engineer, and I know a bunch of engineers. Engineers tend to be a little bit, there's a personality type of an engineer that you see in the discipline. And so it's uncommon to find an engineer who is sort of like, someone who's just having they're just having personal relationships all over the place with all sorts of things everywhere they turn. And that's where I appreciate, Vervaeke's, error checking, because it's like, okay, your personal relationship with your cell phone, that's probably gone a little far. And so but
then people talk about, if you've ever listened to Car Talk from NPR, there's always the discussions about, do cars have a soul?
Yes.
And, in different ways, both from those type of people you were just talking about, but down to the more mechanically minded. Even the mechanic may have a relationship with his vehicle, and it almost seems sometimes as if the car has a certain personality or spirit to it. But and when you mention the personality differences, I think that's really interesting. I don't know that a lot of religious people understand that. And, people are in the denomination that I'm a part of. I don't know if you're familiar with the Worldwide Church of God. Came out of California, but it was years ago. But anyway, there are lots of splinter groups. That organization kind of dissolved back in the 90s, and then there's been subsequent multitude of smaller splinter groups, and I thought that was just part of that was just how that is. But now listening to like Protestantism, like Protestant ministers like yourself, and even Catholics and maybe not so much Orthodox, but like, well, this is more common than I thought, that there are differences of beliefs and differences of opinions and different interpretations. And so, the more, like, I remember Jordan Peterson talking about how political affiliation has somewhat to do with personality differences, and that more liberal types are more on the openness spectrum and conservatives are more on the like conscientious spectrum. And I suspect that that's the same way in the church. But in the church, we want to say, well, everybody has to do it this way. And then we also say you have a personal relationship with God. And then it's self-evident that nobody sees everything the same way. And it's like, okay, so if there's supposed to be a capital T truth out there, it's not self-evident to me that if the Catholics think it's this way and the Protestants think it's that way, and I think that you're supposed to keep the Sabbath and the Orthodox think it's supposed to be that way, then it's either has to be less emphasis on the propositions, or it has to be that somebody's wrong and somebody else is right. And I'm I guess more and more I'm inclined to think that it's less emphasis on the propositions, but that doesn't feel like capital T truth.
Well, think about, so I've got 5 kids, and if you were to, let's say you take my 5 kids and you put them in a room and you start asking detailed questions about me. On one hand, there's whole ranges of things that they would all be in unison about. But if you go deep enough, they're all seeing me through different eyes. And so to say on one hand, to say that there aren't truthful things about me, well, that's true, but their appropriation of these truthful things about me are also going to be filtered through their perception, their experience, their temperaments, their personalities, all of those things too.
And
Now,
their personal, their perspectival relationship, their how they experience you.
Right. Now, when we tend to say something like capital T truth, I think we sort of slip into this monarchical vision and imagine, okay, well, here's capital T truth. Oh, okay. But that isn't to say there isn't a capital T truth about me. I mean, there very much is. I'm a very real thing in the world. But their grasp of that, in many ways, I'm far too real for them to fully apprehend. I'm even too real for myself to apprehend fully, in terms of the little consciousness Congress observer of myself that tries to apprehend myself. And if that's true of a little thing like me, when it comes to God, this is where you have all of this doctrine about, we can never fully know God. And all of that, those doctrinal statements are based not in the psychology of it, which came far later, but in many ways the psychology has affirmed it. I mean, I can't even fully apprehend me. My children know sides of me that I am quite unaware of, and vice versa. So it's, and the propositional, again, you could get wide agreement between my children of many propositional things about me, but you push that conversation far enough and you're going to find propositional disagreements even between my children about me. They're not going to be, a bunch of these physical characteristics. They'll very much be there, but propositions can be, propositional statements can be drawn out of many different things. And so that's just a function of the world we're living in. And so when it comes to something like knowledge of God, it's, it's a difficult thing.
Right. Well, when you put it that way, that makes a lot of sense. And so what that tells me is that then it doesn't necessarily matter what denomination or what group that I make myself a part of, but then that also doesn't necessarily strike me as the right way to look at it per se. Because God, the scripture talks about God wants to be worshiped in spirit and truth, and so it seems like there, in theory at least, there's some more correct ways to look at him or something like that, but then it's like you said, there's different perspectives, there's different personal relationships with God, but then that kind of seems like it can devolve quickly into, well, I have my own church of one, my personal understanding of God, and I don't agree with anybody else, and this is my personal, secret sacred self type of understanding. And well, that doesn't seem like the right thing to do either, but I don't know, it's
well, it's again, there's, and if you think about it analogously, let's say to a personal relationship with another human being, many of those dynamics are all there. My perception of my wife is different from my children's perception of her. And now that my children are all young adults,
Hmm.
it's fascinating having conversations with them, because the what we are to them, they are now in their 20s, they are able to articulate and assert things about us back to us
Right.
that that they couldn't do when they were small children or even teenagers.
Mm-hmm.
And that, in fact, is going to continue to grow, because
Right.
even with my parents, my capacity to have a better understanding of my father, who is deceased, and my mother, who is alive, I mean, that has continued to grow in me as I have grown. And so there's, knowing and the capacity to know are always part of the same package.
Well, and
And
it occurs to me when you say that you also know your wife differently because of because of the relationship you have with her, the position, if you want to call it that, as being married to her, which is different from how your children know her. And that strikes me as like it must be different as a pastor. You might have a different relationship with God as a member of the leadership or the clergy than you do as a layperson.
yeah,
Um,
definitely have a different relationship to the church,
and yeah, that's for sure.
because in the sense, I'm on the inside rather than the outside. There is a line that I'm on one side of rather than the other.
Mm-hmm.
And those perspectives are also consequential often. So, but all of this is in many ways a mystery that is also partly a gift. And,
Mm.
throughout the history of the church, the writings of, people who have sought God and written deeply about their spiritual journeys, you find all of these dynamics in there. And God very much sometimes is very close and alive, and then other times very withdrawn. And
Mm.
you read about that in the Psalms, where are you, Lord?
Right.
And that could be the fact that this person's enemies are, getting the upper hand, or maybe the rains aren't coming in, or, I mean, that's part of why, in a conversation I had with John Vervaeke fairly early on, I don't know. I think this mode of relating is deeply fundamental to who we are. And it's also, it's
What
deep,
mode of relating?
this
Questioning?
not questioning, but this relational
Hmm.
back and forth.
Right.
And in fact, for Vervaeke, because he's got this transjective idea, which is back and forth, I think this is the proper human mode to approach many things, which is why Click and Clack and the car guys, I mean, they might have a relation. They know, they understand the spirit of Saab,
Right.
or the spirit of BMW. Boy, it sure is an amazing machine when it works great, but man, if something breaks down, it's going to cost you.
Yeah.
And yet then there's, the spirit of Saab, let's say, but then there's the Saab that they own, and the Saab that they've had a personal relationship. And in some ways, what one has to do, which is why when you enter into a relationship with God and you say, well, if you're really there, you wouldn't do that with your car. You would sort of pursue your car. And that's, that's very much a dance that you learn. And to say, okay, just to be upfront with God and say, hey, I've got doubts. Okay.
Right.
Just say, I've got doubts. I don't know, but this is what I want. And
That's a little different way of looking at it.
yeah.
Hmm.
And you can, again, you can do that with people. I mean, I've known stories of, I've seen many stories of, I think of some of the first impression I made when I first met the woman who's now my wife, that was positive. But then there were some other, like meetings 2 and 3. But I've known men who have been so persistent that, no, I'm not interested. Okay. Well, then they're not going to be stalkers, and they're not going to be offensive, because again, you're trying to woo a heart here.
Right.
but it's still, hey, this is who I am. This is what I want. And I'm committed. I'm committed to the relationship, even if you're, reticent at this point. And so I think, you know, I think we ought to pursue God with that kind of thing if we want him. Now, some people, it doesn't seem are given a choice. God just, like Moses, God just walks into the relationship and says, yeah, it's you. And Moses like, well, no,
I don't think so. I'm not so sure. Yeah.
No. This isn't a negotiation here. It's
Right.
you. And
so I guess, to be fair, I shouldn't necessarily exclude the possibility that God can't just come into my life and, say, I'm choosing you to do this. And if you don't do it, your life is going to be way harder.
right.
So
And
well,
all of the stuff that you hear in Christianity about his timing, I mean, it can sound so trite, it can sound so lazy, but
yeah,
all of that talk is bearing witness to a reality that people are trying to express that. And I see it all the time. That's part of the reason I just did that video on deconstruction about Audrey Assad. I try not to get too anxious, because if God is who I believe he is, and this character that I find in the Bible, he, look at Moses, the dude's like 80 years old, and he's a would-be deliverer. And it's like, no, you're not gonna kill Egyptians. You're not going to save Israel by killing Egyptians.
right. Well, it's part of it, I guess. What I've appreciated about this corner of the internet is it's given me language, as you like to say, for things that I couldn't really express before. But at the same time, now it's given me language such that I can't even talk to. It's hard to talk to people about this anymore. And so you've been talking about scale a little bit, and so that I question that. It's like, how do I scale all of this down to like normal church type of people that believe specific, scale this down to teaching children about God and having a relationship with God. And I work in construction management right now, and how do I scale all this down to the more blue collar, hands-on, practical type of guy that, all the fancy Vervaeke words that we talk about, and esoteric concepts of, what is real and what is, how does a story work, and all these things. And to me, it's just absolutely fascinating. And, this is one of the maybe my parts of my reconstruction, is that I've tried to forget about religion and God, and like try to walk away from it at some point, but it just never seems to let me go. And like, I just continue to think about these things and question and wonder, and I'm thoroughly steeped in a biblical, say, worldview, just because that's how I grew up. And so like I can't even necessarily walk away from that. And so how does this scale into a marriage? And like I am single, but I would like to be married. And so how do I seek out a woman what kind of a woman should, given all these things that I understand, what kind of should I expect her to be on the same page as this? Because this whole enterprise strikes me as a rather male oriented thing. Like in some ways it's maybe it's just not surprising that there aren't that many women that are part of this discussion, because it maybe not the typical female temperament to think about things this way. But we have to agree on certain things, and it's fine if we're two adults in a relationship, but then you add kids into the mix, and you've got to kind of agree on things, and agree on how to teach things, and agree on what you believe, and and those kind of things. And so it's, if I had to choose what kind of a career should I be in, and sometimes I wonder, like, am I taking this stuff too far? Like, just how much does this need to change my life, or how much should it change my life? So
those are all good questions. The scale thing has everything to do with wisdom,
Hmm.
because, you're probably not going to go to someone and talk about the 4 P's of knowing, or, archetypes or things like that. But we actually scale and compress down in through action. And we can get very esoteric and very verbose about something like love, but love is something that scales readily. If scale actually has everything to do with context and texture, where, okay, love your neighbor, well, that scales down to, okay, what does love look like right now?
We can talk about it all day long and come up with propositions and analogies and blah, blah, blah. And then when it comes right down to it, there's an actual person that I now have to go out and interact with. And like, I think Lewis talked about, I think it's in, is it in the Screw Tape Letters? He talks about, like, here's the new churchman. He comes in and then he sees his fellow his fellow, I don't know, whatever it was, the banker or something, come in, and he's got his squeaky boots and his, funny personality and whatever. He's like, well, don't let this guy focus on whatever problems he might have. Just make him focus on all of those problems with that other guy. And then he'll quickly decide, I don't like being church anymore.
Yeah. Yeah. So scale happens in, again, relationship. It happens in context, and scale emerges. The capacity for scale emerges with need. The saying, necessity is the mother of invention.
Right.
Well, necessity is the mother of inventing scale, because all of this stuff at some point, then you're going to have to apply it. You're going to have to embody it. You're going to have to live it on the ground.
Right.
And that's, in a sense, when the whole stack starts to light up and you say, oh, okay, now everything's gonna, all this talk about loving my neighbor as myself. Boom. Here's this situation and here's this person. What does love require? Well, I'm going to give them money. Okay. Is that what love requires? Maybe money will be a part of it, but maybe it will also be attention and interest and follow through over time. And then again, you're into the relationship and something happens and it takes a different turn. And so you readjust. So that, all the talking and thinking and, all of this stuff we're doing over here, it tends to feed a certain personality type. It tends to feed, again, there's all kinds of constraints on who this is helpful for. And that's absolutely okay. As long as, in my opinion, now we're going to deal with a hierarchy. It helps each of us love our neighbor better and love God better. And those two are obviously connected.
Well, that's a great response then, because I was just going to ask, so what do you think the utility of all of this, that the enterprise that we're involved in here, what do you think the utility of it is? And so I guess in the simplistic terms, in the scaled down terms, in loving your neighbor and loving God better, that's a good way to put it. Well,
we've our time is almost up. I don't know if there's anything. Is this, I don't know how you felt about whether or not this conversation was something that you want to keep between us, or it would be okay for me to share, or you want to review it first. It's up to you.
I think I'd just like to review it.
Okay. I will, after we talk, the video gets rendered and I will send it to you. But I think, I thought this was very good conversation. And I think actually a lot of people would find this conversation useful, because part of the reason I started sharing these conversations was because your questions are not uncommon. You're not the only one struggling with these issues. And so that's why, the conversations never get as many views as, let's say, a commentary video on Jordan Peterson video, but the conversations are really so often where stuff gets applied and where the scale happens. Uh-oh. Do I still have you? So I recorded what I said. You probably missed it. So
Yes, I did.
you'll hear it on the recording. So I will
Okay.
I will render this and I will send it to you and you can look at it. And if you're okay with me sharing this, then I'll do that. So
Okay.
okay.
Well, that's great. I appreciate the time. Thanks, Paul.
Oh, thank you, Sean. This was a pleasure. Take care.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.